Welcome to the Holyland Dispatch podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Holyland Dispatch podcast. We continue with a series of episodes titled The Hunt for Benjamin Netanyahu, this being the second in the series. Although not a must, I still recommend you listen to episode 1 first, just for more context and background. If I wasn't forgetful, I've linked it in the comments to this video. In this episode, we've covered in rapid-fire pace Netanyahu's political career as it was accompanied by judicial persecution. We've touched on the political landscape in which this happened, and still does, and mentioned the main reason for this happening. In today's episode, we will try to dive into the ongoing prosecution as revealed by a few reliable sources. The scope is vast, though we will learn on merit it's what you might call a whole bunch of nothing. Before we move forward, I'd like to correct an error I made in the first episode when I stated that case 3000 related to the German submarines featured in Netanyahu's trial. It is in fact not part of the scope of this prosecution and was actually closed due to insufficient evidence. Not surprising, but worth mentioning. When the trial started, Netanyahu said, "This will end up as nothing, because there is nothing and never was." To be fair, I was skeptical myself, as this is a politician and one facing a trial, so of course he's going to claim innocence. However, this was the case that demonstrated for me the most about the true nature of the left in Israel, and with great help from other wise men, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Thomas Sowell and others, about the nature of the left in general. The left projects its flaws onto the right. They claim that the right can't admit defeat and accept the results of elections. The fact is that the right in Israel keeps winning elections for the last 15 years more or less, and has won the majority of elections since the late 70s. The left's failure to bring forth worthy candidates made it increasingly necessary to take the fight to another arena. The arena is the courts, where they enjoy an eternal home court advantage, pun intended. And so, when an extremely popular candidate comes forth in Benjamin Netanyahu, they did whatever they could to go after him. We outlined the partial list of accusations leveled at him with no success. Now it's time to look at what might turn out to be their last chance. We're going to look at the Bibi trial, as it manifests via what we call the thousands cases, which is a name that wasn't randomly selected. Netanyahu stands on trial on 3 major cases: the 1000, the 2000, and the 4000 cases. Let's start with the allegations as they are detailed in these cases. Case 1000. We briefly mentioned this in the previous episode. The main claim in this case is that between 2011 and 2016, Netanyahu received presents from 2 businessmen, Arnon Milchan and James Packer, totaling in roughly 700,000 shekels. In return, the prosecution claims he worked to further their business interests. The felony named in the case is translated to fraud and breach of trust. Case 2000. This case revolves around the supposed relationship between Netanyahu and the then publisher and main stakeholder of Yediot Ahronot newspaper, Arnon Moses. The main allegations in the case are that Moses offered Netanyahu a much more positive coverage of him and his family in the paper, and in return, Netanyahu was allegedly willing to promote legislation that would place limitation on a breaking competitor in Israel Hayom, thus helping Moses' business interests. The felony in the case is again fraud and breach of trust. Case 4000. This case covers a few subtopics. The first three allegedly involve the chairman of the Ministry of Media at the time, Shlomo Filber, and Shaul Elovich, then the controlling stakeholder of Bezeq Communication Company. It is related to business deals, the way they were closed, as well as some leaks, etc. The fourth one levels the accusation against Netanyahu that in return for what they dub favorable coverage or exceptional coverage in the Israeli website Walla, which was also controlled by Shaul Elovich, Netanyahu interfered in regulatory processes to benefit Elovich's interest in this capacity as the controlling person over Bezeq. Complicated, but it is what it is. The felony named in the case is again fraud and breach of trust, but this time they threw in bribery too. There are more nuances, of course, to these cases, but they all translate eventually to hot air. Some of those nuances will come out through the commentary I want to share with you now, but before I do, I want to credit the sources I'm mostly relying upon. Professor Talia Einhorn is a professor emerita of law from the University of Ariel, an experienced practitioner and a member of the committee that consults the state when hiring senior state servants. Professor Einhorn follows the trial closely and attending sessions and provides valuable analysis. Eli Zipori is a journalist who follows the trial perhaps more than any other in his field and reports on it daily. Kineret Barashi is a lawyer and a TV host. She represented the first woman who complained about sexual assault by the Israeli President Moshe Katsav. Kineret and Eli Zipori work together to bring live updates from the Netanyahu trial sessions. I dare say that there are no people willing to talk who are as close to the happenings in the trial as the aforementioned. The left-leaning media channels barely report on the trial, and when they do, it's brief, colored in lefty misleading colors bordering on outright lies. Not only did Zipori and Barashi provided daily updates, they dove into the cases head first and cross-referenced testimonies with media reports and leaks from investigations, as well as related events to bring certain things to light. The trial started on May 24, 2020, and the prosecution initially named over 300 witnesses. An attempt to run a play-by-play on the trial will take long, probably 5 years plus. Instead, I want to use a piece written by Professor Einhorn, which details some of the many flaws in the process. I want to use as gentle a language as possible, but some of those things brought to light through the coverage of the trial seem like outright crimes committed by the prosecution and others. On December 6, 2024, almost a year ago to the day, Professor Einhorn writes, Prime Minister Netanyahu was indicted in January 2020 for offenses in 3 cases. Case 4000, bribery, fraud and breach of trust. Case 2000, breach of trust. And Case 1000, breach of trust. Ahead of the start of the defense case, a very concise summary of the prosecution case is provided below. The basic law of the government stipulates that a criminal investigation against the Prime Minister must be opened with the approval of the Attorney General. Instead of the required approval, blackened protocols were submitted that do not indicate the scope and content of the approval. The court regretted this, but postponed the decision on the matter to a date yet to be determined. The indictment was filed carelessly and hastily, without a list of witnesses as required by law, while the Prime Minister was visiting the White House at the invitation of US President Donald Trump ahead of the signing of the Abraham Accords. The court ruled that the description of the facts in Case 4000 lacked essential details relevant to the defendant's defense. and ordered the prosecution to amend the indictment to clarify the facts that form the basis of the offense. I'm adding. So the process itself started in sin. You may consider this petty, but considering this is a prosecution against the sitting Prime Minister, you'd think that the prosecution would at the very least follow the law themselves to the T. In addition, what a chicken shit move to do that while the Prime Minister is away on a trip that resulted in multiple peace agreements. On with the professor's article. Case 4000. The amended indictment filed in January 2021 alleged that Netanyahu benefited from extraordinary compliance or positive coverage in 315 coverage events on the negligible news website Walla, controlled by the Bezeq Group, and in return granted regulatory benefits to Bezeq, owned by Shaul Elovich, whose wife Iris is also accused in this case. The amended indictment also included a list of 338 prosecution witnesses, most of whom the prosecution did not call to the witness stand, but until the last moment refused to reveal which of them it had waived so that the defense could not contact them. I'm adding here, those 315 coverage events are at the heart of the alleged bribery charges. A group of people gathered together voluntarily to scan these 315 alleged events and published their findings stating zero positive coverage on Netanyahu in Walla. Even without doing full research, anyone visiting Walla couldn't even have made the mistake of feeling anything positive being said about Netanyahu. And what a dirty trick it was to hide the list of witnesses and the ones left out from the defense. It's almost as if the prosecution doesn't care about justice and instead only wants to win a political battle. Back to Professor Einhorn. The main prosecution witnesses, Walla CEO Ilan Yeshua, Walla employees and state committee member Nir Hefetz, confirmed in their testimony that the 315 coverage events included events that did not happen, non-exceptional events or reports that were provided to all media channels, and negative coverage events. Me again. So not only independent researchers couldn't find exceptional or positive events in Walla, in fact, the prosecution witnesses themselves revealed lies, misleading, and lack of evidence altogether. In fact, the judges themselves have told the prosecution that they recommend removing the bribe charges based on the findings. Professor Einhorn continues. The law requires that the investigation materials be handed over to the defense. Attorney Jacques Chen, Elovich's attorney, accidentally discovered tens of thousands of documents that were hidden from the defense behind an unfilter button in a file that was given to him. Thanks to them, we learned that the presentation of Ilan Yeshua in the main investigation as someone who abhors politicians and acts only as Elovich commands was false. Yeshua met with Netanyahu's opponents without Elovich's knowledge, in part on his own initiative, and gave them sympathetic and indulgent coverage. The only one he never spoke to was Netanyahu, who generally, quote-unquote, earned negative and hostile coverage. The prosecution offered 3 excuses for hiding the documents. The first, that the material was irrelevant, a claim that Judge Moshe Baram commented on. I cannot understand how materials indicating Yeshua's compliance with other politicians are irrelevant. The claim does not stand because the ruling and the state attorney's directive state that the main reason for the right to review is to allow the defendant to discover evidence in the investigation material that may assist him in his defense and thus ensure that his right to fair trial is kept. The second excuse, that the police classified the materials, not the prosecutor's office, but the police had an accompanying prosecutor, and the responsibility rests with her. The third excuse was they knew that the material had reached the defense attorneys and decided not to demand that it be returned. This excuse is worse than the concealment itself. Did they hope that Jacques Ren wouldn't click unfilter and reveal what was hidden underneath? Alright, what is Professor Einhorn saying here? First, it was another devious attempt by the prosecution to hide evidence from the defense. Then they tried making excuses for this, again shirking their responsibility. Is this breaking the law? I can't say with 100% certainty, but it sure smells like it. Moving on with the professor's comments. Witnesses Nir Schwartz, head of Nir Hefetz's investigation team, and Yaniv Peleg, his subordinate, testified that they did not investigate whether the events in the indictment actually occurred, and that they did not question Benjamin Netanyahu and state witness Nir Hefetz about them. They, as well as the chief prosecutor Yoav Telem, admitted that it is not proper to file an indictment without confronting the suspect with the suspicion raised against him, as if they investigated a bank robbery on Yirmiyahu Street in Tel Aviv without verifying there was even a bank branch there. Me again. You can start to identify a pattern here. Investigators admitting they did not in fact investigate allegations that are now leveled at Netanyahu based on investigation. Whose investigation? What was it about? How is that related to the charges against the Prime Minister? Furthermore, they state again that procedures are not followed. A suspect should be confronted with, the suspicions against him. But when it comes to prosecuting the Prime Minister, somehow procedures be damned. Einhorn goes on. In his cross-examination, Deputy Chief Yoav Telem admitted to illegal interrogation exercises, to using spying tools, such that are not allowed to be used against Israeli citizens, against Shlomo Filber and Iris Elovich, and to jumping to conclusions about the exceptional coverage in Walla without making a comparison to other media outlets or other politicians. Without exceptional coverage, there is no bribe. So, just like this, in a couple of lines of testimony, a very senior investigator admits to breaking the law in order to get the result. Illegal interrogation exercises? No problem. Illegal use of spyware? No problem. Amateur investigation with zero effort to make any comparisons? No problem. The goal justifies the means, and the goal is bring us Bibi's head. And if you think that there was any kind of media storm following these outrageous findings, you are dead wrong. Israeli mainstream media completely ignored these crimes and still does. The exceptions are Channel 14 and Galei Israel radio station. In other stations, if they even bothered to report, they breezed through these as if they were nothing. What was some of the alleged illegal techniques? Let's talk about Iris Elovich, a woman in her early 60s, arrested before dawn, dragged to be interrogated in a police station for hours. Then, when her interrogation session ended, she was taken from one lockup facility to another under the pretense of no available bunks, ending up exactly where they wanted her, in a cell with a police plant who tried to milk her for info. Interrogators used Shaul Elovich's son to pressure him by threatening to ruin his family. Conversations between Elovich and his son in a conference room was tapped. Shlomo Filber's phone was breached illegally using a cyber tool. All of those were widely reported by Mr. Zipori and Kineret Barashi and were wholly ignored. Let's get back to Professor Einhorn's article. She says, Director General of the Ministry of Communication Avi Berger, the Director General who was followed by State Witness Shlomo Filber, and the Chairman of the Cable and Satellite Council, Dr. Ifat Ben-Chai Segev, testified that there was no consideration or regulatory benefit. Netanyahu's lone signature on what was called the Bezek Yes merger was a signature of compliance required by law itself, after all the relevant regulators, including the Attorney General of the Ministry of Communications, the head of Competition Authority, and the chairman of the Cable and Satellite Council had already approved the deal without his involvement. Attorney Ben Tzur proved from the phone records, which were in possession of the investigators, that the meeting in which Netanyahu supposedly instructed Shlomo Filber to do good to Bezek did not take place and was only planted in his mind by the prosecution during the investigation. One of many investigations that were not recorded in violation of the law. The prosecution's attempt to declare during the trial the prosecution witnesses Filber and Dr. Ben-Chai Segev as hostile witnesses, hostile to the truth, as it put, was unsuccessful. If the prosecution had believed in the huge sums that were leaked to the media as regulatory benefits, but for some reason were not mentioned in the indictment, it would have had to sue not only the Elovich couple, but also the corporations that allegedly benefited from their actions and seize the value of the benefits as required by the state attorney's instructions. Its failure to do so indicates its own lack of belief in the allegations in the indictment. The judge's proposal to the Attorney General's office to withdraw the bribery charge in Case 4000 was rejected by the Attorney General. In this paragraph, what stands out to me the most are the arrogance of the prosecution, as well as its apparent dishonesty, not to say deviousness. First, let's talk briefly about that meeting that Professor Einhorn referred to. Part of the allegations includes a claim that Shlomo Filber met with Netanyahu, and during that meeting the Prime Minister instructed him on how to perform his part of the alleged bribe. The problem is that there is absolutely no evidence that such a meeting took place. The respective calendars contradict it, and as she mentioned, even using cell phone records, no such meeting could have been established. So where did that come from? Shlomo Filber went through a very rough interrogation, including a physical search, which he claims crossed the line between necessity and sexual harassment. His claim was rejected by the court, but there is no doubt that he was treated very harshly in order to turn him into a state witness. During these investigations, he was coaxed to first bring this story up, which he quickly retracted. As we know, even the judges tired of the bribe accusation and recommended the prosecution takes it off the table. So after we discussed the deviousness of the prosecution, now we witness their utter arrogance when they reject the judge's recommendations, even in light of all the evidence pointing to absolutely no bribe. We continue with Professor Einhorn's text. Case 2000. According to the indictment, Arnon Noni Moses, the controlling shareholder and chairman of the board of directors of the Yediot Achronot group, suggested to Netanyahu that he improves his coverage and that of his family members, and in return Netanyahu would allow the circulation of the competing newspaper Israel Hayom to be limited. The trial proved that there were members of Knesset who wanted to adopt a bill drafted by Yediot Achronot's lawyers to prevent the distribution of the free newspaper. They received very sympathetic coverage from Yediot Achronot, for whom the limiting circulation of the competitor was worth a fortune. In contrast, Netanyahu, who wanted to open the media market to additional players, only conducted sham negotiations with Moses. In practice, he bought time until he managed to dissolve the Knesset to prevent the adoption of this anti-democratic law. Netanyahu also could not have provided the goods himself, since he did not own Israel Hayom. Moses was accused of offering a bribe, and Netanyahu was accused of fraud and breach of trust, claiming that he did not stop the talks with him sooner. Instead of receiving a reward for his efforts to open the media market, Netanyahu received an indictment, while those who worked to limit the distribution of Israel Hayom in contradiction with Moses and received compensation were not even investigated. So somehow Netanyahu, working against Arnon's Moses' interests, was interpreted as fraud and breach of trust, while others who cooperated with Moses were not even looked at. Not only is that a two-tier prosecution, it's another example of the outrageous weaponization of the judiciary against Netanyahu. Back to the professor. Case 1000. We have seen an upside-down world. Netanyahu, who invests day and night in working on the affairs on the part of people and state, is presented as a hedonist who received gifts of cigars and bottles of champagne over 3 years in the amount of 776,691 shekels from Arnon Milchan and James Packer. In the examination of the main witness Hadass Klein by attorney Amit Haddad, it became clear that the imaginary amount, which reflected the vast majority of purchases of champagne and cigars of various types offered to Milchan and Packer's many guests, was based solely on Klein's testimony, which was not supported by forensic evidence, delivery notes, original receipts, or additional testimony, as also emerged from Milchan's testimony, given in the presence of the attorneys and lawyers in a visual conference in England. The gifts amounted to gifts for holidays and birthdays over 6 years, in a total amount that is less than a tenth of the above amount. The stories about jewelry supposedly given to Sarah Netanyahu have also not been proven. A pair of earrings allegedly given to her were intended for a woman with pierced ears, but Mrs. Netanyahu does not have pierced ears. So here, the prosecution is relying on a single testimony from a single person who couldn't produce a single evidence to support her ridiculous claims. Milchan himself denies it, and there were holes in her story, well, not holes, but caverns. One example were those earrings that could be of no use to Mrs. Netanyahu. Another is the fact that the brand of cigars she brought up is definitely not what Netanyahu smokes, and Milchan knows that too. No receipts, no footage of any delivery of goods, and we're talking truckloads here. No documentation of any kind at all. It is actually embarrassing watching this trial unfold. Now Professor Einhorn talks about the multiple infractions by the prosecution, police and others, all in order to take Netanyahu off the political landscape. I will quote someone later about that too. The crimes of the investigation. The serious crimes of the law enforcement system should be revealed in the interrogation rooms. Interrogation materials were hidden from the accused. Use of spyware and cyber weapons, police plants, leaks of interrogation materials. Investigators testified that they lied in applications submitted to the courts in order to allow the arrest of people who were not suspected of anything, tortured witnesses and abused them as if they were a ticking time bomb. Nir Hefetz suffered from being deprived of blood pressure medication, from starvation, from sleep deprivation, from bed bugs that caused itching and blisters, from the threat of destroying the family, from spending the night in the company of security prisoners who threatened him. Iris Elovich suffered from spending the night in the company of rats, from being moved from one detention center to another, from threats about her husband's health if she did not give a version, from the interrogation of her elderly and sick mother. Elovich's close associate suffered from knowingly making a false statement to the court, allegedly being suspected of money laundering, intimate requests during the investigation unrelated to the case. Shaul Elovich suffered from seizing family property without a warrant, from abusive interrogations, from financial ruin and physical exhaustion. Shlomo Filber suffered from humiliation, from threat that he would not be allowed to attend his son's bar mitzvah, from memory implantation. Netanyahu's chief of staff, David Sheran, from spying and memory plantation. The investigators did not seek the truth, but rather the extraction of a version that would echo what they wanted to hear, namely incriminating material against Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was reported that Commissioner Roni Alshich, who publicly boasted that he had read every word of the investigations, referred to the Prime Minister's entourage as a criminal organization. The police officers testified that everything was done under closed daily supervision of the prosecutor's office. Neil Schwartz testified that hundreds of police officers and dozens of prosecutors were recruited for this mission, and all at our expense. This is an interim summary. The criminal justice system in Israel needs a fundamental overhaul. The presumption of innocence of the accused has not been fully established. During the prosecution's case, the prosecution failed to prove a single offense and is now hoping to build the defense's case in the Arabian Nights cases. I will also add that in Israel the principle of the fruit of the forbidden tree does not apply. That means that the police or the prosecutors could use anything, even if they got it by breaking the law. The list of apparent criminal offenses used to incriminate a prime minister seems like fiction, but they are as real as they come. And now comes the question, why? Let me quote Commissioner Roni Alshich, who was mentioned previously by the professor. He stated that no one could have guessed that he, Netanyahu, would not resign. In light of everything we learned, I think he just gave us the answer. Why? Because it has absolutely nothing to do with non-existing bribes or the bogus offense called fraud and breach of trust. They have no evidence, no reliable witnesses. So why? The answer is simple. They mounted this judicial attack on Netanyahu, assuming he'd crumble and resign. Too bad for them, he is made of a different cloth. With the great help of Eli Zipori, Kineret Barashi, and as exemplified here by Professor Talia Einhorn, all of whom know more about this trial than anyone outside the judicial system, we now know. Well, that was quite long, but I hope it was eye-opening. Next time, we will discuss the request for pardon, speculate on the results of the president's decision about it, and the future of Netanyahu as well as the state of Israel. Until then, thank you very much for listening to the Holyland Dispatch podcast. God bless.